The sun had already set on Pine Street when Mrs. Wilson noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully steered her old blue Toyota to the curb, her arthritic hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than usual. At 87, she'd been driving for over 6 decades without a single ticket, and this sudden interruption to her peaceful evening drive home from her weekly bridge game made her anxious. Rain had started to fall, creating a soft pitter-patter on her car roof as 2 police officers approached her vehicle. Their flashlights beam cut through the darkness, shining directly into her windows. Mrs. Wilson squinted, the bright light making it even harder for her aging eyes to see clearly. "License and registration," the first officer demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, and his partner looked even younger. Mrs. Wilson's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, the way they often did these days. I have them right here somewhere," she said softly, beginning to sort through her organized but full handbag. The rain was getting heavier now, and she could feel the officers' growing impatience as they stood there getting wet. "Ma'am, we don't have all night," the second officer said, tapping his fingers on her car door. "This should be a simple process." His tone carried that particular kind of condescension reserved for those deemed too old or too slow to function in a fast-paced world. Mrs. Wilson's fingers brushed past old receipts, her medication list, and several birthday cards from her grandchildren before finally finding her wallet. But as she pulled it out, her arthritis caused her to fumble, and the contents spilled across her lap and onto the floor of her car. "Oh dear," she whispered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as she tried to gather everything up. The officers exchanged a look that made her feel even smaller. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the first officer commanded, his hand moving to rest on his belt in a way that seemed unnecessarily threatening to the elderly woman. Mrs. Wilson looked at the heavy rain outside, then back at the officer. "In this weather, I'm not sure I can." "This isn't a negotiation," the second officer cut in. "Step out of the vehicle now." A few cars drove by slowly, their headlights illuminating the scene. Some passers-by noticed the elderly woman's distress, but nobody stopped. Mrs. Wilson could feel tears welling up in her eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the sheer frustration of being treated like a troublemaker when she'd only been driving home from playing cards with her friends. What these young officers couldn't see, as they stood there in the rain, making an elderly woman feel like a criminal over a broken taillight, was the silver-framed photo sitting on her mantel at home. A photo taken just 15 years ago, showing her standing proudly in front of the very same police department, surrounded by smiling officers at her retirement ceremony. They couldn't know about the hundreds of young police cadets she taught over her 40-year career, helping them understand the importance of community relations and human dignity. Mrs. Wilson gripped her steering wheel tighter, gathering her strength. Despite the ache in her joints and the disrespect in the officers' voices, she held onto something they didn't expect. Wisdom born from decades of experience with law enforcement, and a plan already forming in her mind about how this unfortunate encounter might just become a valuable lesson for everyone involved. The cold rain soaked through Mrs. Wilson's cardigan as she slowly made her way out of her car. Her feet, wrapped in her comfortable brown shoes that her daughter had given her last Christmas, splashed in a small puddle. The officers stood impatiently, not offering any help as she struggled to keep her balance. "Could one of you young men please?" she began, reaching out slightly for support, but the first officer stepped back, acting as if he hadn't noticed her unsteady hand. "Stand by the trunk of your vehicle," he instructed, his voice carrying over the sound of passing cars and falling rain. A small group of people had gathered under the awning of the corner store across the street, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Wilson could feel their eyes on her, and her cheeks burned with embarrassment. The second officer was going through her registration papers, letting them get wet in the rain. "These papers are outdated," he announced loudly, though they weren't. Mrs. Wilson had always kept her documents perfectly organized, a habit from her teaching days. "No, they're not," she said softly, rain dripping from her silver hair. "If you look at the date." But the officer spoke over her, turning to his partner. "We've got expired registration here," he said, as if she wasn't even there. Mrs. Wilson felt her heart sink. In all her years working with the police department, she'd never seen officers treat anyone this way, let alone an elderly person. A young mother hurried past with her children, pulling them closer as if Mrs. Wilson was some kind of criminal. The little boy looked back at her with wide, curious eyes, and Mrs. Wilson managed a small smile, even in her distress. She'd taught kindergarten for many years before moving to the police academy, and children had always been close to her heart. "Ma'am, do you realize how serious this is?" the first officer questioned, shining his flashlight directly in her face. Mrs. Wilson squinted, raising a shaking hand to shield her eyes. "Officer, I can assure you," she tried again, but was cut off. "Turn around and face your vehicle," the second officer commanded, his tone suggesting he was dealing with a stubborn teenager rather than a respected elderly woman. Mrs. Wilson's arthritis made even this simple movement difficult. The rain had gotten heavier, and her clothes were completely soaked now. She could feel water squishing in her shoes, and her legs were starting to ache badly from standing. An ambulance passed by, its sirens momentarily drowning out the sound of the officers discussing her case as if she wasn't there. The lights reflected in the wet pavement, creating dancing patterns that reminded her of the police academy graduation ceremonies she used to attend. "Please," she said quietly, "I'm getting very cold. Could we perhaps—" "This wouldn't take so long if you had your papers in order," the first officer snapped. "Maybe you should consider if you're still fit to drive at your age." Those words stung more than the cold rain. Mrs. Wilson had taught countless officers about dignity, about treating every member of the community with respect. She thought about all the lectures she'd given about the importance of understanding elderly citizens' needs, about patience and compassion. A car slowed down as it passed, and Mrs. Wilson recognized Mrs. Kumar from her bridge club. The look of shock on her friend's face made the humiliation complete. Tomorrow, everyone at the senior center would be talking about how poor Mrs. Wilson had been treated like a common criminal. But as she stood there in the rain, something unexpected was happening inside her mind. Instead of anger or resentment, she felt a familiar spark, the same one she used to get when facing a challenging situation at the academy. These young officers needed something more than a complaint filed against them. They needed a lesson, but not one of punishment. No, Mrs. Wilson was already forming a different kind of plan, one that would transform this moment of humiliation into something much more meaningful. Back in her warm house after that terrible rainy night, Mrs. Wilson sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a soft blanket her granddaughter had knitted for her. Her eyes wandered to the wall of photographs that told the story of her remarkable career, a story those young officers knew nothing about. The largest photo showed her standing proudly in front of the police academy 20 years ago. She was younger then, her hair more pepper than salt, but she had the same determined look in her eyes. That was the day she'd introduced her revolutionary community relations program, the one that would go on to change how hundreds of officers interacted with the public. She remembered clearly the day the current police chief, Mr. Martinez, had been just a nervous young cadet in her class. He'd sat in the front row, always taking notes, desperate to learn everything he could about building trust with the community. Now his picture hung there too, from the day he was promoted to chief, insisting that Mrs. Wilson pin the badge on his uniform herself. Her fingers traced over another frame, this one showing her receiving an award for 40 years of service to the police department. The ceremony hall had been packed that day. Officers, former students, and community members all gathering to celebrate her contributions. Some of her former students had even flown in from other states, where they now headed their own police departments. The shelf below held dozens of thank you cards from officers she'd taught. You showed me what real police work is about. One read. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding people. She kept every single one. Mrs. Wilson picked up her favorite photo, dusting it gently with her sleeve. It showed her teaching one of her last classes before retirement, surrounded by young cadets as she explained the importance of treating elderly citizens with patience and respect. The irony of tonight's situation wasn't lost on her. Her old teaching manuals still sat on the bookshelf, their pages filled with her handwritten notes about building community trust, handling difficult situations with compassion, and understanding the unique needs of different community members. She developed most of these programs herself, drawing from her earlier experience as a kindergarten teacher, because in many ways, she discovered the key to both jobs was the same: patience, understanding, and a willingness to listen. Next to her chair sat a stack of commendation letters from 3 different police chiefs, praising her work in transforming the department's approach to community policing. She had helped create the guidelines that officers still use today for interacting with elderly citizens, or at least, they were supposed to use them. The corner of her living room held a small cabinet filled with awards. Excellence in Police Training, Outstanding Contribution to Community Relations, Lifetime Achievement in Law Enforcement Education. But it wasn't the awards that mattered to her. It was the changes she'd seen in her students, watching them grow from uncertain cadets into compassionate, effective officers. Her phone sat on the side table, and she kept glancing at it, thinking about those 2 young officers from earlier. They reminded her of so many others she'd taught over the years. Young people who'd started out thinking police work was all about authority and control, only to learn that true authority comes from understanding and respect. A small smile crossed her face as she reached for her phone. Those officers had no idea who they'd mistreated tonight. But instead of using her connections to file a complaint, she had a different plan. After all, she'd spent her life turning difficult moments into teaching opportunities. Why should this be any different? She opened her old planner, the one she still kept perfectly organized. Inside were phone numbers that could still open any door at the police department. But more importantly, it contained 40 years' worth of wisdom about how to turn conflict into understanding. Tomorrow, she would make a call, not to complain, but to teach one final, unforgettable lesson about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of community policing. The next morning, Mrs. Wilson woke up early, just as she had done every day during her teaching years. She made her morning tea in her favorite blue cup, the one her students from the academy had given her years ago. As she sat at her kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft colors, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the numbers she knew would connect her to the Internal Affairs Department. One call, that's all it would take to start an investigation into those young officers' behavior. The thought made her pause and take another sip of her warm tea. Through her kitchen window, she could see Officer Lee from the local precinct helping old Mr. Johnson with his groceries across the street. That's what real police work looked like, the kind she'd spent 40 years teaching. Her mind wandered back to the countless workshops she'd led, showing young officers how small acts of kindness could build lasting trust. The clock on her wall chimed 9 times. Mrs. Wilson straightened her back, made her decision, and dialed a different number instead. "Good morning, this is Beverly at the front desk," came the familiar voice she'd known for years. "Hello, Beverly, dear. This is Mrs. Wilson." She could hear the immediate warmth in Beverly's response. "Would Chief Martinez be available? I have something important to discuss." While being transferred, Mrs. Wilson opened her old teaching notebook. The pages were worn, but the ideas were still fresh. Notes about empathy training, community engagement, and understanding the elderly. Her arthritis made it a bit difficult to turn the pages, reminding her of how she'd felt in the rain last night. "Mrs. Wilson." Chief Martinez's voice boomed through the phone. "What a wonderful surprise. I was just telling our new recruits about your community outreach program yesterday." She smiled, remembering him as a young cadet, eager to learn. "Robert, I have a proposal for you," she said, her voice calm but determined. "I'd like to come back and conduct some workshops." There was a pause on the other end. "Workshops? But you retired years ago." "Yes, but it seems some of your younger officers could use a reminder about how to treat elderly citizens." She didn't mention the previous night's incident. Not yet. As she outlined her plan, she could hear the excitement growing in the chief's voice. She suggested a series of hands-on training sessions, where officers would experience what it felt like to be elderly, wearing glasses that blurred their vision, weights that stiffened their joints, and gloves that reduced their finger mobility. "The young ones need to understand what it's like," she explained, "to fumble with papers when your hands don't work like they used to try and read registration documents in poor light when your eyes aren't what they were." Chief Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Wilson, this is exactly what we need. The department has been receiving more complaints about how our younger officers interact with elderly citizens. When can you start?" She glanced at her calendar, already imagining the faces of those two officers when they realized who she was. "How about next week? And Robert, dear, could you make sure all your night shift officers attend, especially the ones working traffic stops?" As she hung up the phone, Mrs. Wilson felt a familiar spark of excitement. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about turning an unpleasant experience into a valuable lesson, just as she'd done throughout her entire teaching career. She spent the rest of the morning pulling out her old teaching materials, updating her notes, and planning exercises that would open these young officers' eyes. On her desk lay a pile of thank you letters from former students who'd become respected officers, each one a reminder of how understanding could change hearts and minds. This would be her gift to those two officers who'd stood in the rain, treating her like a bothersome old woman. She would help them see the elderly citizens in their community not as problems to be dealt with, but as people deserving of dignity and respect. Sometimes, she thought, the best response to unkindness wasn't anger or complaints. It was education. The police station's training room buzzed with the usual chatter of morning briefing. Officers filled their coffee cups and grabbed seats, some looking tired from night shift, others scrolling through their phones. The two young officers from the traffic stop sat near the back, barely paying attention when Chief Martinez stepped up to the podium. "Today's training is special," the chief announced, his voice carrying authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "We have someone I deeply respect joining us. Someone who shaped not just my career, but the entire department's approach to community policing." The back door opened, and Mrs. Wilson walked in, her step steady despite her age. She carried her old leather teaching bag, the same one she'd used for decades at the academy. The two young officers from the rainy night didn't look up at first, too busy whispering to each other. "Please welcome Mrs. Wilson," Chief Martinez said, his voice filled with pride. "For those who don't know, she spent 40 years training officers in this very room." The two officers' heads snapped up at the sound of her name. Their faces turned pale as recognition dawned. Mrs. Wilson caught their eye and gave them a gentle smile, the kind she'd always used when students were about to learn an important lesson. "Thank you, Robert," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Before we begin, I'd like to share a story about something that happened just last week." The two officers sank lower in their chairs as she described the rainy traffic stop, not mentioning any names, but painting a vivid picture of the experience. Other officers in the room started turning to look at their colleagues, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Chief Martinez's expression darkened as he realized who had treated his former teacher so poorly. But Mrs. Wilson's tone remained kind as she opened her bag. "Today, we're going to understand what it feels like to be elderly in our community." She pulled out sets of special gloves designed to stiffen fingers, glasses that clouded vision, and weights to make movement difficult. "Would anyone like to volunteer to try finding their driver's license while wearing these?" she asked, holding up the gloves. The two officers from the traffic stop raised their hands immediately, their faces showing a mix of shame and determination. As they struggled with the simple task, dropping cards and fumbling with their wallets. Understanding began to dawn in their eyes. Other officers took turns trying different tasks, reading fine print with the clouded glasses, getting in and out of a patrol car with weighted joints. When I was your age, Mrs. Wilson continued, showing a photo of herself as a young teacher. I thought I knew everything about police work. But then I started teaching here, and I learned that true strength isn't about showing authority. It's about showing understanding. The morning passed quickly as she shared stories from her years of teaching. She told them about officers who had learned these lessons and gone on to make real differences in their communities. All the while, the two young officers who had stopped her watched and listened intently, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine interest. During the lunch break, they approached her nervously. Mrs. Wilson, the first officer said, his voice thick with emotion, "We had no idea. We're so sorry about that night." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes," she said softly. "What matters is what we learn from them." The second officer cleared his throat. Would you tell us more about your time teaching here? About what you learned about dealing with elderly citizens?" Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled as she pulled out her old photo album. "Let me show you something," she said, opening to a page filled with pictures of smiling officers and grateful community members. "This is what real police work looks like. It's about building bridges, not walls." As other officers gathered around to listen, she knew this wasn't just about teaching anymore. It was about passing on a legacy of compassion and understanding to a new generation of officers who would carry these lessons forward. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable started happening at the police department. The two young officers who had stopped Mrs. Wilson that rainy night became regular visitors at her workshops. They didn't just attend, they arrived early, helped set up the classroom, and stayed late to ask questions. During one session, they worked with elderly volunteers from the community center. The first officer spent an hour helping an 85-year-old woman practice getting her license and registration out of her purse while wearing the simulation gloves. His patience surprised everyone, especially himself. "I never realized how frustrating it could be," he told the class later. "All those times I got annoyed at elderly drivers fumbling with their papers." He shook his head, remembering his own behavior that rainy night. His partner had his own breakthrough moment while helping an elderly man with a walker cross the street during a practical exercise. The man was telling stories about his time in the military, and the young officer found himself completely absorbed in the conversation. "You know what's funny?" he said to Mrs. Wilson afterward. "A month ago, I would have seen this as wasting time. Now I understand. These aren't just tasks to get through. These are people with whole lives, whole stories." The change wasn't just in these two officers. Word spread through the department about Mrs. Wilson's workshops. Officers from other shifts started showing up on their days off. The break room conversations changed to two. Instead of complaining about difficult elderly citizens, officers shared tips about how to better serve them. One rainy evening, much like the night of the traffic stop, Mrs. Wilson received an unexpected visit. The two officers stood on her porch, holding a box of her favorite tea they'd learned about during one of their conversations. "We were doing traffic stops tonight," the first officer explained, "and we helped an elderly lady whose car had broken down. She reminded us of you." His partner nodded, adding, "We made sure she stayed dry and warm in our patrol car while we changed her tire." Mrs. Wilson invited them in, and over cups of steaming tea, they shared more stories from their shifts. They told her about small changes they'd made, carrying a small flashlight to help elderly drivers read documents, keeping a supply of rubber grips in their patrol cars to help with tight jar lids or stiff door handles. The other day, the second officer said, his eyes bright with pride, "I spent an extra 10 minutes helping an elderly couple understand their traffic violation. Instead of just handing them a ticket, I explained everything clearly, made sure they knew their options. The husband hugged me before they left." Their radio crackled. they were needed back on patrol. As they stood to leave, Mrs. Wilson noticed something different about their uniforms. Pinned next to their badges were small silver pins shaped like helping hands, a symbol from her old teaching days. Chief Martinez found these in storage, one explained. They were given to officers who completed your community relations course years ago. We asked if we could wear them. The next morning at the station, more officers were wearing the silver hands. It had become a quiet movement, a visible sign of commitment to Mrs. Wilson's teachings. Young officers would stop their older colleagues in the hallway, asking about the pins, wanting to know how they could earn one. During that month's community meeting, the police department received 3 different letters praising officers for their exceptional kindness toward elderly citizens. Chief Martinez read them aloud, beaming with pride. 2 of those letters mentioned the same officers who had once stood in the rain, making an elderly woman feel small and powerless. Mrs. Wilson sat in the back of the room, watching as her simple decision to teach rather than complain rippled through the department, transforming not just 2 officers, but an entire community's approach to serving its elderly members. The local newspaper ran the story on a sunny Tuesday morning. The headline read, "Former police trainer turns traffic stop incident into community transformation." Below it was a photo of Mrs. Wilson surrounded by officers wearing their silver helping hand pins, all smiling warmly at the camera. The story spread like wildfire through the small town. Mrs. Wilson's phone kept ringing with calls from old friends and former students. But what touched her heart most was how the community began to change. At the grocery store, she overheard an elderly man telling his grandson about how an officer had spent 20 minutes helping him change a flat tire, even showing him how to use his new phone to call for help next time. The officer turned out to be one of the 2 who had stopped her that rainy night. The senior center, where Mrs. Wilson played bridge every Thursday, became a hub of positive stories. "An officer helped me carry my groceries yesterday," one lady shared during their weekly meeting. "He even asked about my grandchildren and remembered their names from last time." The local coffee shop owner, who had witnessed the original traffic stop incident, couldn't believe the transformation. He watched through his window as the same officers who had once been so harsh now regularly helped elderly customers cross the busy street, often sharing a joke or a kind word. One day, a reporter from the city's biggest news channel showed up at the police station. She wanted to do a special feature on how a single incident had sparked such meaningful change. The 2 officers who had stopped Mrs. Wilson that night volunteered to be interviewed. "We were wrong," the first officer said on camera, his voice filled with emotion. But Mrs. Wilson didn't want revenge. She wanted to teach us, to help us understand. His partner nodded, adding, "She showed us that being a good police officer isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about serving people with dignity." The story caught attention across the state. Other police departments started calling, asking if Mrs. Wilson would consider sharing her training program. She found herself drawing up lesson plans again, this time with help from the 2 officers who had become her most dedicated students. At the monthly town council meeting, an elderly resident stood up to speak. "I used to be afraid when I saw police cars," she admitted. "Now, when I see those silver pins on their uniforms, I know I'm looking at someone who understands, someone who cares." The local high school invited Mrs. Wilson and the officers to speak to students about community service. The teenagers sat quietly, listening to the story of how a potential complaint became a catalyst for positive change. After the talk, several students signed up to volunteer at the senior center. Even the coffee shop where it all started felt the impact. The owner created a community corner, where police officers and elderly residents could gather for free coffee and conversation. It became a regular sight to see uniformed officers sitting with senior citizens, sharing stories, and building bridges between generations. One evening, as Mrs. Wilson walked home from her bridge game, she saw one of her former students, now a police captain from a neighboring town, training his officers in proper interaction with elderly citizens. He was using the same techniques she'd had taught him years ago, now enhanced by recent experiences. The local paper ran a follow-up story 3 months later. Crime rates hadn't changed much, but something more important had: trust. Elderly residents reported feeling safer, more respected, and more connected to their community. The police department's community satisfaction ratings had reached an all-time high. But for Mrs. Wilson, the real success wasn't in the headlines or statistics. It was in the small moments. Seeing an officer help an elderly woman with her car door, watching young recruits proudly earn their silver pins, hearing stories of kindness and understanding replacing fear and frustration. She had turned one difficult night into a movement that was changing hearts and minds, one interaction at a time. 6 months after that rainy night, Mrs. Wilson heard a knock at her door one Saturday morning. Outside stood the 2 officers, but they weren't in their uniforms. Instead, they wore casual clothes and carried toolboxes. "We noticed your front steps needed some repair," the first officer explained, shuffling his feet almost shyly. "And the porch railing looks a bit wobbly. We thought maybe we could help fix them up for you." Mrs. Wilson invited them in for coffee first, served in her favorite china cups that she usually saved for special occasions. As they sat in her cozy living room, she noticed how different they seemed from those 2 angry young men who had stood in the rain that night. "You know," the second officer said, carefully holding his delicate coffee cup, "my grandmother called me yesterday. She said she saw the news story about our department's elderly outreach program." He paused, his voice getting softer. "I had never told her about that night in the rain. But I told her yesterday, and she cried. Then she told me she was proud of the man I've become." While they worked on the steps, Mrs. Wilson brought them lemonade and watched as they carefully measured each board, making sure everything was secure and safe. They even added a non-slip surface to the steps, something they'd learned about in one of her workshops about preventing falls among elderly residents. Other officers started dropping by regularly too. Some would bring groceries, others would help with small repairs or just sit and chat. Mrs. Wilson's home became a sort of unofficial meeting place where officers would come to seek advice about difficult situations they faced on patrol. One evening, the first officer arrived looking troubled. He had handled a traffic stop with an elderly man who reminded him of his late father. "I didn't just see a driver with a broken taillight," he explained, sitting in Mrs. Wilson's kitchen. "I saw someone's dad, someone's grandpa. It hit me hard." His partner started organizing monthly dinners where officers would bring their own elderly relatives to meet their colleagues and share stories. These gatherings helped younger officers see beyond the badge and uniform, understanding that everyone has a family, a story, a life worth respecting. They began keeping notebooks, just like Mrs. Wilson had during her teaching years. They wrote down the names of elderly residents they met on patrol, remembered their stories, their grandchildren's names, their concerns. Small details that showed they cared. The second officer started teaching rookie officers himself, sharing what he'd learned. "Before you turn on those flashing lights," he would say, "remember that the person in that car could be someone's Mrs. Wilson. Treat them the way you'd want your own grandparents treated." During that autumn, when leaves needed raking and gutters needed cleaning, the 2 officers organized a department-wide volunteer day. Dozens of officers spent their day off helping elderly residents prepare their homes for winter. The same hands that once held flashlights too bright now held rake handles and gutter scoops. Mrs. Wilson watched from her porch as they worked in her yard, these 2 men who had become like sons to her. They weren't just better officers now, they were better people. Their growth wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. One day, the first officer brought his young daughter to meet Mrs. Wilson. As the little girl sat coloring at the kitchen table, he explained to her, "This lady taught me the most important lesson of my life. She showed me that sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most beautiful changes." They kept coming back, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They shared their daily challenges, celebrated their successes, and sought guidance when they faced difficult situations. Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table became a place of learning, growth, and understanding, proving that sometimes the best classrooms don't have walls. 1 year after the rainy night traffic stop, the police department's main conference room was packed with people. Old photos of Mrs. Wilson teaching at the academy lined the walls, and a large banner hung at the front. Inaugural Margaret Wilson Excellence in Community Policing Awards Ceremony. Chief Martinez stood at the podium, his silver helping hand pin gleaming under the lights. A year ago, he began, a simple traffic stop could have ended very differently. Instead, it became the spark that changed our entire department. Mrs. Wilson sat in the front row, wearing her favorite blue dress, the same one she'd worn to her retirement party years ago. Beside her sat the 2 officers who had stopped her that night, now among her most dedicated supporters. Today, the chief continued, "We're not just giving out awards. We're celebrating a way of treating people with dignity and respect. Every officer wearing these silver pins represents a commitment to Mrs. Wilson's teachings." The first award recipients were, fittingly, the 2 officers from that rainy night. As they walked up to receive their awards, one of them wiped tears from his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson taught us that being a good police officer isn't about power," he said into the microphone. "It's about understanding." His partner added, "She could have filed a complaint that night. Instead, she chose to teach us. And that choice didn't just change our careers, it changed our lives." The ceremony included videos of elderly community members sharing stories about their positive interactions with police officers. One showed the local baker talking about how officers now regularly check on his shop late at night, making sure he gets safely to his car. Another featured an elderly couple describing how officers helped them during a power outage, bringing them flashlights and staying until their children arrived. The award itself was beautiful. A crystal statue of 2 hands clasped together, symbolizing the bridge between police and community. But more meaningful were the stories behind each nomination. Officers were recognized for actions both big and small. Helping an elderly man find his lost dog, spending extra time explaining traffic laws to senior citizens, organizing transportation for elderly residents during bad weather. Mrs. Wilson was asked to speak last. As she walked to the podium, every officer in the room stood, their silver pins catching the light. "A year ago," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I stood in the rain, feeling helpless. Today, I stand here feeling hopeful." She looked out at the faces before her, not just officers, but community members, former students, and friends. This award isn't about punishment or shame. It's about growth. It's about remembering that behind every badge, behind every civilian interaction, there's a human being. The department made the award an annual tradition. But more importantly, they created a permanent training program in Mrs. Wilson's name. Every new officer would now learn her methods, understand her principles, and earn their silver pin through demonstrated compassion and understanding. After the ceremony, at a small gathering in the break room, one of the original officers showed Mrs. Wilson something on his phone. A simple note he kept as his screen background. "Before you act, think, what would Mrs. Wilson do?" The local news called it a fairy tale ending, but Mrs. Wilson knew better. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. As she watched young officers eagerly learning from their older colleagues, saw community members greeting police with smiles instead of fear, she knew her legacy would live on long after that rainy night was forgotten. That evening, as she sat in her favorite chair at home, Mrs. Wilson looked at the award ceremony photos added to her wall. Among them was a new one, showing those 2 young officers from the traffic stop, now wearing their trainer badges, teaching a room full of cadets. Above their heads hung a simple sign with words that had become the department's unofficial motto: "Serve with dignity, lead with understanding. The Wilson Way."